record.
All right, I'm recording. Cool, thank you.
No problem.
Hopefully everyone can see my screen here.
Yep.
Before Lou starts his presentation, I just want to give you a little information about stc-pmc and some stuff we have going on right now. Hold on, my slideshow stopped. There we go. Okay. So just a little quick background in case you're not familiar with stc-pmc. We are a society for technical communication chapter, and it is an organization for technical communicators, which include all of the things listed on the screen: technical writers, content developers, graphic artists, pretty much any of those things. And that's just a minimal list. There's a lot more. And we cover the Philadelphia metro area, which includes southeastern Pennsylvania, South Jersey, and Delaware, not just Philadelphia. And here are a few of the many neighborhoods that are covered by our Philadelphia metro area. You might see some familiar names on here. And that's just to give you an idea of the wide variety of different locations and all the different people that can join the Philadelphia metro chapter. And here are some good reasons why you might want to join stc-pmc. Number one, you can meet other technical communicators in your area. You can find your next sweet gig on our exclusive job board. I found a lot of great jobs on there. You can get certified with the STC certification. You can learn new skills with some of our online courses and educational events. You can keep up with the latest in technical communication with our blog and also the STC magazines, and be part of the cool crowd and make your friends jealous. You can look cool like these people right here. And all you have to do to join is go to stc.org and just remember to pick Philadelphia Metro Chapter when you're checking out your membership.
And you get a leather jacket if you do?
Unfortunately, we don't have leather jackets made up, but you will be pretty cool if you join. Another thing, we have some volunteer opportunities right now, including our treasurer. We need a treasurer right now. We had a temporary treasurer and we now have none, so it's very important that we find one soon. And it's actually a lot easier than you think. You don't have to be an accountant. If you can balance a checkbook, you can be our treasurer. And here are a few reasons why you should give it a try. Number one, it looks great on your resume, being a part of a professional organization and volunteering your time. And it helps you to gain some valuable career skills that you can use, leadership skills, things like that. You can you can do it from the comfort of your own home. So it's socially distanced, it's safe. Most of our meetings, well, all of our meetings right now are virtual, and our events are virtual. We're hoping to have some in-person ones eventually, but at the moment we're completely remote. And you can help us keep being an awesome chapter. So if you're interested, you can send an email to me, president@stc-pmc.org. I'll show all this information again at the end of the presentation just to give you a reminder, because I know I would forget. But please definitely consider it. And now we're ready for our feature presentation, which is Lou Prosperi. And I'm going to turn it over to you in just a moment. Let me see. There you are. Okay. You should be a presenter now.
Yep. Okay. I want to share this. You all seeing that screen?
Yep, I see it.
Okay. I need to make this I just need to make that a little bit smaller on the side because it's taking up a lot of, oh, there we go. All right, good. It was eating up a lot of the real estate and I couldn't even see my own slides. So I'm going to go into slideshow mode and I'm going to swap presenter. So this is what you're seeing. Hopefully you're seeing a full size screen of my splash page. So thank you very much for having me, and it's great to meet you all. My name is Lou Prosperi. I'm a senior manager for documentation and curriculum at Oracle Utilities. Oracle Utilities is a small, relatively small business unit within the larger Oracle company that you may be familiar with. And tonight we're going to talk about adding Disney Imagineering to your technical communication toolbox, or the way I like to talk about this is tell your story the Walt Disney World way. And I sort of draw a parallel between us explaining concepts and conveying information to our audience and telling a story, and that'll make more sense as we get a little further along. So just to introduce myself, I have about 30 years as a professional writer, 15 years of that, and there's some overlap between some of these years. I am not 72 years old, but I worked as a game designer and writer in the adventure game industry, sort of like Dungeons and Dragons. I did freelance writing as well as an on-staff position. I've spent the last 22 years as a technical writer and instructional designer. For what is now Oracle, I worked originally for a company called Lodestar Corporation, which was a smaller utility company that was absorbed into Oracle. The last 12 years of that, I've been a documentation manager. I manage a small team. It's been as big as 10, and right now it's only 3 or 4 of us. And then outside of when I worked as a game writer, I had several books. I worked on several books that were published. Outside of that, I'm the author of 3 books. The 3 that you see here: the Imagineering Pyramid, the Imagineering Process, and the newest one, my 3rd book, the newest one up front, Tell Your Story the Walt Disney World Way. And these are about, I love Disney parks, and I'm fascinated with Imagineering and the thinking and the process that goes into, the process of saying we need something new in Fantasyland, and then 4 years later seeing the 7 Dwarfs Mine Train be there. And what is the process they go through to create that, and what are the principles at work? And not only am I fascinated about it because I love the Disney parks, but also because I think there are lessons for us in terms of being creative and doing creative things. And as we'll see tonight, I think there are lessons that can apply specifically to what we all do as technical communicators. So that's what we're going to look at in a little more detail. So in terms of an overview, what we're going to see, we're going to start with an introduction of technical communication and Imagineering, and what's in your TechComm toolbox. We're going to take an Imagineering storytelling tour of the Magic Kingdom. We're going to look at a lot of principles of Imagineering and techniques and practices and how they're implemented in specific attractions and venues in the Magic Kingdom. Then, because I went to your website and saw the write-up of this event that Maureen wrote, I've added a little bonus for the PMC group, which is going to be a quick look at the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror and how some of these principles are at work there. I loved the write-up, but I wanted to make sure there was a tie into what what Maureen had written on the website, as well as to what I was going to present. So I added a slide, and we'll talk a little bit about the Twilight Zone. It's one of my favorite attractions, so I don't mind it all. And then we'll look quickly at this Imagineering storytelling toolbox checklist. Sorry, and those are questions that we can use to sort of hone in and look more closely at how we're using these principles. And then I have some closing comments. So to get started, we're going to talk about technical communication and Imagineering. So when you think about your technical communication toolbox, we generally think of software tools. And so, what we're talking about is technical communication. And if we think about the tools, it's often these things, right? A lot of us use Ditto. We might use Arbortext or Oxygen or XMetal to work in that. We might publish with the Ditto Open Toolkit. Maybe some of us are still using FrameMaker. A lot of us are using content management systems. All of these things. And then I included style guides because those are off. I'm sorry, what was that? Okay, I wasn't sure if somebody had a comment or just forgot to be on mute. Doesn't matter, all good. But ultimately, what I notice when I think about this, and this is something I also notice when I look at the agenda of lots of conferences, is that a lot of this focuses on the technical side of technical communication. And our job is to communicate with our audiences, and these tools, well, obviously they're important. Very few of them, if any of them, will actually help us explain something to the audience. They'll help us present it to the audience and help us build a workflow and work stream that allows us to, do multi-channel publishing and single sourcing and those things, which are great, but they don't really help with the communication part. One way I like to think about this is we focus a lot on the adjective and not enough on the noun, right? So the question then becomes, where could we look for tools, distinctions, ideas to help on the communication side of things? And I'm certainly not going to suggest that what I'm going to talk about tonight are the only things. There's other places, but as we get into it, we need to think about what is communication, and I'm a big believer in going back to the basics and really looking at definitions of things, because I think common, sometimes you'll share some ideas and people will say, well, that's common sense. And I think that's going to happen tonight. You're going to see some things and you'll say, well, of course. But the truth is, common sense does not always equal common practice. So I think it's important sometimes to remind ourselves of the basics. So in our case, when we talk about communication, according to Oxford, we're talking about the successful conveying or sharing of ideas and feelings, or the imparting or exchanging of information or news. So it's all about effectively conveying concepts and information to an audience. And so, well, that's good. Again, where can we look to find effective principles of communication to help us do that? And my answer comes from an unexpected place. Now, when I say unexpected, I don't mean that I'm about to surprise you because you came to this session knowing that it had the word Disney and Imagineering in the title. But I do think it's still unexpected in that you would not normally, most people, hopefully all of you after tonight will, but most people wouldn't necessarily think about going to Disney World as a place to learn about technical writing. But again, my answer comes from, an unusual place or a non-standard place. And again, it's Disney parks. In this case, these three pictures are are weenies, which are one of the techniques we're going to talk about, but they're locations within three of the parks. In the middle, we have Cinderella Castle from the Magic Kingdom. On the left, we have Spaceship Earth from Epcot, and on the right, we have the Tree of Life from Animal Kingdom. And more specifically than just Disney parks, again, based on the title, my answer is about Imagineering. I believe Imagineering is a great source for insight in terms of how we can communicate. So why do I think that? So if we talk about what is Imagineering, technically speaking, Imagineering, the word, is a portmanteau formed of the words Imagineering, imagination, and engineering. Now, that's okay, but it's a little flat. So I much prefer the definition that Walt Disney used, which is the blending of creative imagination and technical know-how. Because this reminds us that it's creative and it doesn't speak to, say, just engineering. It's about technical know-how of all sorts. And that includes, in our case, the technical know of how to use some of those technical tools, how to take content and architect it in such a way using, say, data topics and maps and things that we can produce multiple types of output from the same source. And some of that, takes some creative imagination. And so I think this definition works a little bit better. Now, when Walt was designing Disneyland, when he first wanted to do Disneyland, he could not go and find people that had designed theme parks before. They didn't exist in the same way. It's often said that Disneyland is the first theme park. That's not 100% true. There are other parks that were definitely themed. One of the prominent influences on Walt Disney designing Disneyland was Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen. When he was designing Disneyland, he talked to architect friends of his. The one in particular was a gentleman named Welton Beckett, a well-known architect in the Southern California area. And what he said was, well, you're going to need to use real architects and real engineers when you build this place, but you're going to have to use your own people to do a lot of what you're talking about, because real architects and real engineers are traditional architects and engineers don't understand the storytelling thing that you want to do. He wanted to bring the films to life. And so he went to his own studio, and the very first folks that became Imagineers were art directors and animators who took storytelling techniques and principles from animation and filmmaking and adopted them and adapted them to three-dimensional storytelling when they designed Disneyland. And just like they took their ideas and principles and techniques from animation and filmmaking to apply it to theme park design, we can take those same, adopt those same Imagineering principles to what we do. And so over the years, Imagineering has developed and honed a number of principles about what they do and how they do it, each of which has insights that I think can help us in our technical communication jobs. And so how do they do this? So as I said before, story is a fundamental part of this. And at their core, Imagineers are storytellers. At the heart of Imagineering, of this theme park design thing that they do, it's effective communication. The Imagineers use a variety of techniques and tools and disciplines to convey specific ideas and experiences to their audience. That's what they're doing. Now, these experiences and ideas, they're stories. Now, not stories in necessarily the traditional narrative, three-act structure, or rising tension, denouement, etc. But story in the idea or in the sense of a shorthand for the core idea or premise that underlies an attraction or land or a venue. So when the Imagineers tell a story, they're communicating an idea, which should sound familiar because that's really the basis of what we talked about earlier about what communication is. So when we talk about the Imagineers and how they tell their stories, we're saying how they communicate their ideas. And we're going to look at what happens underneath, or behind the scenes, and how they're doing that, and how it can apply to what we do. So to do that, we're going to take what I call an Imagineering storytelling tour of the Magic Kingdom. So this is a map of the Magic Kingdom from the Disney World website. And what we're going to do is we're going to start down here at Town Square and walk down Main Street and over into Cinderella Castle, and then over to Liberty Square, and then from Liberty Square to Adventureland, and then up to Frontierland, and then back into Liberty Square, and then over into Fantasyland. And along the way, we're going to look at these 15 principles. We're going to look at specific examples of how the Imagineers use these to tell their stories. So we're going to start with something called a weenie. Weenie is a term for a visual magnet or attraction that draws the audience's attention. And Walt Disney coined this term when he was talking with his Imagineers. He said, "You got to build a weenie," which is, one of the best examples in Magic Kingdom is Cinderella Castle. This is what guests see when they enter Town Square. They come in through some entrance tunnels underneath the railroad station, and they come around Town Square, and they get to look down Main Street, and this is what they see. And the first thing most of us think when we see this is, "Oh, I want to go see more." And so that's what a weenie is designed to do. It's a visual magnet that attracts the audience and draws them in to the experience and wants them to learn more. And so when the Imagineers tell their story, they attract the audience's attention and capture their interest. So in our world of technical communicating, how can we do this? And I believe there are some very simple ways to do this. Sometimes just a well-structured table of contents with thoughtful names for chapters and sections can work as a weenie, because it helps the audience quickly at a glance see if they should pursue the rest of your content. I think the same is true of advanced organizers in content. I know that some folks who are proponents of minimalism would tell you that some advanced organizers, and for those of you who may not be familiar with that term, if you've ever seen at the beginning of a document, you'll see like an introductory paragraph, and this chapter includes the following, and a series of bullet points, which are headings. Those are what are known as advanced organizers. I think those work as a weenie because they tell the audience, come and see, this is what you're going to find, and come and check it out and learn a little bit more. And so that's a very simple way at how we can implement a weenie, like, again, the name of the chapter or the name of a section. If you're doing training, you can do the same sort of thing. So let's move on, because we could talk about each a lot. The next one is a really fundamental one. Story is the essential organizing principle behind the design of the Disney parks. When they design anything, they start with a story, and they use that story to inform all their decisions. It's the fundamental building block of everything they do. And the example of this I'm going to use is at the end of Main Street, USA, right before the big open space, which is known as the Hub, is a restaurant called Casey's Corner. It was originally called the Coca-Cola Refreshment Center. It's still sponsored by Coke, as you can see in this sign. And you can probably see that it says Casey's Corner, but here's a little bit better one. And Casey's Corner is based on and inspired by primarily a Disney animated short that was in after the war, or during the war and after the war, Disney the business went down and they couldn't afford to do full-length animated features, but they did what they called package films, which included a number of short films. And one of those included a short called Casey at the Bat, which is inspired by a poem called Casey at the Bat. It's a well-known poem, and it's about a local baseball hero, a baseball team, the Mudville Nine, that are playing, and Casey's their hero, and it's the bottom of the ninth, and he's up, and if he gets a home run, they win, and if he strikes out, they lose, kind of thing. And so this whole restaurant is based on that. And so as we go through, if we walk in, here's the menu, and you can see the pitcher is throwing the ball, has pitched the ball, and that's Casey about to swing. And to spoil the story, he's about to strike out. Unfortunately, it's not a great day for the Mudville Nine. But you can also see, if you look underneath the sign, those enter signs that are shaped like baseball, those are the ordering stations, and the whole counter area is sort of set up like a concession stand. The cast members wear baseball uniforms and umpire aprons. And throughout the whole establishment, there are pennants and pictures and other decorations of baseball players and baseball teams. You can see the baseball bats and hats, and then here's the scoreboard that shows the Mudville Nine lost that day. And so the whole thing, every decision they made about the decor and the decoration and the whole environment is inspired by Casey's Corner, or Casey at the Bat. So when the Imagineers tell their stories, they decide the story they're going to tell, and they use that as the basis for all their decisions moving forward. In our world, what that means, I equate that to our subject matter. What are we writing about, and what are we telling our audience about? And the importance there is a couple things. To know the line, where to draw the line, especially when we're talking about in the world of enterprise software where I work, we often have to document our integrations with other tools. And knowing how much to say about those other tools is an important distinction. Sometimes our subject matter experts ask us, put in all this information about these integration components. And we often have to push back and say, that's not our subject matter. The people who write that stuff have already written pages and pages and pages about that. Let's point them to that and tell them only what we need to do. So by really focusing on what is our story and what is our subject matter, we can better communicate with our audience to make sure we, don't talk about things that are a little off the subject. One example, I documented an integration tool years ago, for example, that did data mapping. And when you mapped data from an incoming XML file into a database structure, you could map from each XML element to a specific column in a table. And you could either have it directly, or you could use different technologies to manipulate the data, including JavaScript, VBScript, VB itself. There's a handful of other technologies. That documentation about this adapter tool was not the place to explain to somebody how to use SQL or how to use VBScript. We had to talk about our tool and then assume that they would learn the details of the other ones there. So focusing on your story is really zeroing in on your subject matter and what you're really writing about. So now we're going to take another look at Cinderella Castle and something called long, medium, and close shots. As we approach Cinderella Castle, so this is the same picture we saw before, we get a general impression of the castle. As we move a little closer, we see more detail, like we see these lamp posts, right, in the wrought iron, and we start to see the shapes of the bricks. And we might notice as we get closer But the bricks are not all as uniform in color as we thought, right? We see a little bit more detail. And then as we go inside the breezeway of the castle, on one side, there's a series of these mosaics. This mosaic is about 10 feet, 15 feet tall, about 10 feet wide. And there's 5 of them, and they tell the story of Cinderella. And then in between them are pillars, and at the tops of the pillars are these little sculptures, and the sculptures are of Zach and Gus and the birds that help Cinderella get ready for the ball. And so we start with an establishing shot down, you know, from the hub or from Main Street of Cinderella Castle. And as we get closer, we get more detail. We see more and more detail that reinforces the story that this is not only a castle, it's a fantasy castle, but it's actually Cinderella Castle. So this is about moving from the general to the specific, which is just, you know, again, this is one of those common sense things, I think, but every so often it helps, I think, for us to stop and say, hey, am I really organizing my content in the general to the specific? One thing I've noticed when working with subject matter experts is sometimes they'll feed you a stream of content that is not necessarily organized that way. And so we have to think about, you know, how do we lead our audience from a general impression and an establishing shot and, you know, a big picture overview of something into the nitty-gritty details that they may need to do their jobs. And so this is an example of long, medium, and close shots. And when the audiences tell their story, they lead the audience from a general impression to specific scenes and details. And again, we should do the same thing. We should not start with very low-level details about how to configure this switch or this setting. We need to start and say, hey, you are, you know, installing and implementing this software application or whatever the subject matter may be. But we need to, you know, lead our audiences the right way, from the general to the specific. Again, this is not a new idea, I'm sure, for most of you, but hopefully this is a way of thinking about it that you maybe have not seen before. So we're going to stay with Cinderella Castle for one more, and this one is something called forced perspective. I mentioned earlier that the first Imagineers were filmmakers, and they took a lot of their techniques from filmmaking and applied it to theme park design. Long, medium, close shots that we just saw is one of those, but another is forced perspective, which is a theatrical technique that's used where the designer plays with scale to affect the perception of the audience. And Cinderella Castle is one of my favorite examples of this. So Cinderella Castle is 189 feet tall. No structure at Disney World is over 200 feet. The tallest one is 199, and that's because anything that's 200 feet or higher has to have an aircraft beacon marker on it. And you know, imagine if you looked at Mount Everest, the Expedition Everest attraction at Animal Kingdom, and at the top of the peak of the mountain you saw a flashing light. That would kind of take you out of the story. So everything is below this 200-foot ceiling. Cinderella Castle looks much taller than that, but what they do is they use forced perspective to adjust the size. So if we see these bricks at the bottom, and then if you look more closely in this close part of the picture, if you look at the pillars there, the bricks are smaller. And what happens is, if we look at another example, the bricks and architectural features are larger at the bottom of the picture than they are at the top. So as we move our way up the structure, the architectural detail gets smaller and they play with scale, so building looks much bigger than it is. The same is true on Main Street, USA. I don't have pictures of that, but on Main Street, the facades of the buildings, the first floor are 90% of real size, the second floor are 80%, and the third floor are even smaller. And so we see a 3-story building, but it's not really 3 stories. So it helps lend a feeling of intimacy, but also it doesn't have to be a 3-story, a gigantic structure. And so when the Imagineers tell their stories, they use the illusion of size. Very often they use it to make buildings look bigger than they are. They also use it in reverse to make them look smaller than they are in some cases. Over at Epcot, there's an example of that. The American Adventure Pavilion is actually a 5-story building, but it's set in colonial times, and they didn't have 5-story buildings in colonial times. So they actually used forced perspective in reverse, and they designed things so it actually looks like a 2-story building, but it is a 5-story building. So how can we use this in our world? Well, very often very often we want to make things actually look smaller than they are or simpler than they are. And this simplicity idea is related to another technique we're going to talk about in a few minutes. You know, sometimes we want to make a process or a configuration effort or some chunk of content feel a little less daunting than it is. So for example, and a couple ways to do this before I get to the example are what we might call grouping and chunking. So if you have a really big thing, you might chunk it into smaller pieces to make it more manageable. In terms of grouping, let's suppose that to configure a particular piece, you know, again, I work in software, so a lot of my examples are going to be that way. But in order to configure a particular feature, there's 37 steps involved. Providing a list, a numbered list of 37, 1 through 37, will seem daunting to any audience. But if you had 4 lists, you know, one item of 10, one list of 10 items and 3 lists of 9 items, that may feel a little better to the audience. So they're doing 4 things, and you know, each one is 9 or 10 steps, but at least it's not 37 steps. And so there's just ways to sort of chunk and group our content to make things a little more friendly and not so overwhelming to our audience. So that's a way we can use force perspective. Next, now we're going to go inside Cinderella Castle. So we've pretty much stayed outside. Now we're going to go right inside. And if you may recall, I talked about those mosaics. As you walk in from the direction that we're traveling in towards Fantasyland, the last one actually has a doorway built into the mosaic. So it sort of wraps around the doorway. And that doorway leads into a facility called the Bippity Boppity Boutique, named for Bippity Boppity Boo. From Cinderella. And that is a place where children can get a prince or princess makeover. So, you know, I've seen examples of young girls going in and, you know, they want to be Cinderella. So they get their hair done up like Cinderella and they're wearing the blue gown and the white gloves and, you know, and so I had the opportunity to meet the art director of that particular facility. And when talking about it, he said he had 2 design goals in mind. The first, which was a bit of a joke, sort of a tongue-in-cheek, he wanted to create an environment that men did not feel comfortable in. But more importantly, and you know, with the hairspray and stuff, you know, patient fathers, of course, will go and spend time with their kids, but you know, it's definitely not the place where they're going to feel generally relaxed. But again, more of a joke. The more important goal he had was he wanted the guests there during their makeover to feel that at any moment Cinderella might walk in. So you're like, well, how do you do that? Well, when you walk into this establishment, right on the left-hand side as you walk in, there's a scroll that you see here. And this scroll, I'm not going to read it, but it announces that there's a ball tonight. Royal Princess Cinderella and Noble Prince Charming are having a ball, and you are humbly invited. And well, you need to get ready for the ball. And so the guests at Bippity Boppity Boutique are getting ready for the ball. And this tells us that that's happening. And Cinderella needs to get ready for the ball too. So she could show up anytime because, you know, if you're getting ready for the ball, then she has to get ready for the ball. So it's just a way to sort of imply, you know, create this atmosphere that this is not just a store where you go to get a cool makeover, but this is you're getting ready for the ball and Cinderella has to as well. And so this is the way the Imagineers create what they call creative intent, which is the specific design goals that the designer wants to accomplish, or perhaps a better way is what is the experience that the designer wants to create for their audience. And so in this case, they want to create this experience of Cinderella may walk in at any moment. Now, the Imagineers do this in a couple other ways. One of the most basic ones is these short little descriptions of some of the attractions that you see that you might find. These are screenshots from the website, but you'll get these in the guide maps, the paper guide maps, as well as the My Disney Experience mobile app that you can use, that a lot of guests use in the map. And these descriptions, you know, like Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, race through the Diamond Mine from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs on a swaying family coaster ride. They tell you what you're going to experience. They explain the creative intent. So when the Imagineers tell their stories, they stay focused on their objective and their reasons for telling the story. Creative intent is something that's created and decided on very early in their design process, and they use it as a lens and a way to focus their effort to make sure that whatever they do, however they decorate the buildings or whatever music they use or lighting or whatever they might do, the costumes of the cast members, all of it helps to convey the creative intent. So what's creative intent in our world? That is our objective in creating a document or content or experience, whatever we're building. What is our objective? What do we want our audience to learn or to know by the time they're done this? And this is another way, sort of like our subject matter. These are two very fundamental principles that help us narrow our work as we're working on things. As you add a chapter, as you add a section to that chapter, as you add a paragraph to that section, as you add a sentence to that paragraph, perhaps it's worth asking, does this help me with my creative intent? Does this piece of content that I'm working on help me meet my objective, which might be telling someone how to install software, how to configure software, how to use it, whatever, and something that we sometimes struggle with in terms of when we hear information from subject matter experts, feedback from them is they want to put stuff potentially in the wrong place. And we need to push back and say, no, the goal of this document is to do X, Y, Z. You're trying to have it do ABC, and we need to do that in a different way. So we can use this again as a lens or as a filter to make sure that we're staying on target. So now we're going to leave Cinderella Castle, and on the real tour, if we were in the Magic Kingdom, what we would do is we would walk out and we would take a left, and there's a little pathway that cuts over to a land called Liberty Square, and that's where we're going to look at something called attention to detail. Detail is a thing that's well known with Disney, particularly in the parks. They pay very close attention to lots of details, and again, Liberty Square is one of my favorite places to talk about this. As we walk in, there's a building called the Yale Christmas Shop, and outside one of the doors is this sign: music and voice lessons by appointment only, Ichabod Crane instructor. That tells, we know Ichabod Crane is from that period of time, so it helps reinforce the story. On one of the other parts of this building, there's this little sign: Keppel established 1779. 1779 helps set the stage for the time frame. I'm not sure what you meant by that, Mahu, but we'll get to it later. 1779 helps establish the time frame of when this setting is when this land is set. Keppel actually is a reference to Walt Disney's grandfather. His name was Keppel Disney. But there's lots of other details in Liberty Square. There's an area called the Court of Flags, where there's a flag from the original 13 colonies. This is a picture of the Massachusetts flag. That's where I'm from. If you look up and see the window shutters on many of the buildings, you'll see they're crooked, like in this picture here. That's because during colonial times, metal was used for ammunition and weapons, and they didn't have it, so they used leather straps for the shutters, and the leather straps would stretch. Now, ironically, they're made of metal now, but they actually put them on crooked on purpose. Another detail is this: there's a window. This is right near the Hall of Presidents. And as you see in this window, there's two lanterns, a reference to Paul Revere's poem, Two If by Sea, One If by Land, Two If by Sea. And then speaking of the Hall of Presidents, I don't have pictures of it, but all of the clothing that's worn by the president audio animatronic figures is authentic to the time period. So, for example, Abraham Lincoln is wearing clothes that are constructed based on the way they were made during the Civil War. And Washington's is colonial style. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's figure actually has braces on his legs under his pants. So they go to great lengths to focus on details. And then this is the last one. If you walk through Liberty Square, most of the pavement is this red color that you see on either side of this gray stripe, but through the middle of all the walkways is this gray stripe. And if you were to ask a cast member in Liberty Square for where the nearest restroom is, he or she would tell you that there are no public restrooms in Liberty Square because there was no indoor plumbing in Liberty Square, in colonial times. And this gray streak that runs through the walkways is a indication of that, because this is sort of represents what the streets were like because people had to dump their waste. Obviously, this is not real waste. It's just there to reinforce this whole time period and level attention to detail. So when the Imagineers tell their story, they pay attention to every detail. And again, this is just one of the places to look at it, but we're going to see lots of there's lots of other details. And of course, in our work, we need to pay attention to detail, right? We can't provide inaccurate details, and we need to, make sure that the details we provide are accurate and pertinent to what we're talking about. But there is another element to this that I like to talk about, and that is that details draw attention to themselves. So we need to be careful which ones we use, because think back to middle school or even high school and word problems. One of the keys to solving word problems is to sort of will your way through all the words to figure out which parts of it really matter and which don't. Like, simple example, Peter and John are brothers and they're both driving away from each other at 35 miles an hour. It doesn't matter that they're brothers, but so we need to be careful about which details we use, because we don't want to draw our audience's attention away from the important information by providing sometimes extraneous details or extra details. So we just need to be mindful of the way we use them and how we use them, so that we're not interfering with our message, right? So because that could cloud our subject matter, and it could interfere with our objective and our creative intent. So a lot of these tie together, obviously. So we're going to move on from Liberty Square over to Adventureland, and we're going to basically, there's a little cut through if you are walking on from in Liberty Square towards Frontierland. If you take a left right at the Diamond Horseshoe restaurant, there's a cut through that takes us over into Adventureland. We're going to talk about something called pre-shows, and we're going to talk about it at Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room. This was one of the first attractions to really use audio animatronics. And it's, if anyone's ever been there, basically the room comes alive and sings to you. So when you come up here and you go into the queue, you go through a turnstile and you go into the queue. The queue is sort of a pair of curved walkways that surround a lagoon. And across the lagoon is this little temple or wall. And then about 5 or 7 minutes before the show open, the doors open and the show starts, this opens, and these two cans, pardon me, Clyde and Claude, come out and sing a song and tell a story, and basically introduce the idea of what they call the Sunshine Pavilion, which is the Tiki Room. And so they sort of introduce the story to us. So when the Imagineers tell their stories, they introduce the audience to the story before it even starts. So they sort of let you know what you're about to experience. In our world, I liken this to that old phrase, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. That's a public speaking thing. That's what this is about. And this part is obviously tell them what you're going to tell them. And this this is something that I definitely do in training development and instructional design, where you do sort of a lesson overview, like I did a little overview of this whole session. But you might do that just to have a very, an introductory chapter might be that. Now, I know a lot of us don't write books anymore. We're writing just content, and the way our audience engages with it is generally in very small pieces at a time. But I still think there's value. I believe there's value in overview content and overview chapters and introductions, which can basically tell the audience what they're going to see. This document provides blah, 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 blah. In a way, that's like a pre-show. It tells you what you're going to experience as you go through the rest of the document. So it's just a way, pre-shows are just a way for us to, again, introduce our audience to what they're going to experience before they really get to it, just to sort of set the stage and provide some context. So we're going to stay in Adventureland. We're going to step across the way, and directly across from Tiki Room is Pirates of the Caribbean, a classic attraction. Now, here's a little trivia that some of you may not know. Pirates was not an opening day attraction at Walt Disney World. There's a couple of reasons why. First, because it was a huge attraction, a huge success at Disneyland, but because Florida was so close to the Caribbean, the Imagineers actually thought, yeah, people won't be that excited about pirates. They were not correct. They were clamoring for pirates, and so they opened it very quickly after the park opened. There is another reason they didn't do it. There were plans at one time for a pirates-like attraction called the Western River Expedition that would have been in Frontierland, that they were designing and planning, but for budgetary and practical reasons, they could not do it in the opening. They couldn't get it into the opening menu for the park, and then eventually, you know, the demand for pirates came, and so they had to do that, and so there were a bunch of, you know, mostly business reasons why that other attraction never happened. And among hardcore Disney folks, the Western River Expedition is like, you know, sort of the holy grail, like, oh, I wish we could have had that. Anyway, Pirates of the Caribbean is one of my favorite places to talk about this next principle called readability. So Pirates, for those of you who may not be familiar, is what's called a dark ride. It's a ride through the dark. I know that sounds kind of simple, but in dark rides, the audience only has a chance to see each scene for a few seconds because the vehicle is constantly in motion. And so you don't have minutes to stare at a particular scene, you know, unless the ride breaks down. We don't talk about that. But for the most part, the way it's designed, you only have a few seconds. And so the audience needs to be able to understand those quickly. And so they do that by creating what they call readable or very easily understood scenes, and what are equivalent to sort of like sight gags in animation in cartoons. You know, just one quick look and you instantly get it. So there's a couple different examples of that here. In the Fast Pass queue, as you walk in, so the queue of the Pirates of the Caribbean is a big Spanish fort, and you walk by, you know, cannons and stacks of cannonballs and things. But at one point, you come across a wall, and the path that you're on makes basically like a U-turn around to the left. But at the end of it, there's a wall with this jail cell window. And if you look into it and look down, you see this, and you see these two pirates basically at a stalemate. And so it only takes us a couple seconds to get what happened. They literally stared at the board until they became in their current state. Later in the attraction, at the end, so after you board your boat and you go down the drop and you go by the big ship and you go through the town, eventually you get to the point where the city is on fire and you go into a tunnel that is going through a jail, and we come across this scene, and we see, now what we can't see in this picture is behind them the city is burning, so they're pretty desperate to get out. And so the dog has the key, and they're trying to attract his attention. And so this is another scene that within just a few seconds, you instantly understand what's happening. And so these are examples of readability. And when I talk about that, when the Imagineers tell their stories, they simplify complex subject. They look for ways to take you know, it's not rocket science complexity, but it's still a more complex subject that you would, you know, if you had to describe it in words, it might take quite a few words, whereas one picture, you get it much quicker. So how do we use this? Well, this is actually the principle that led me to creating this presentation, led me to writing the book that it's based on, all of that. As I mentioned, I was fascinated with it and with Imagineering, and I wanted to understand the process and how it might apply to game design, which is something I had done and was interested in, as well as and instructional design. And I was reading a book about Pirates of the Caribbean, and it talked about how they had to create scenes that were readable quickly. And I realized that's what we do in instructional design. When we have a diagram or a picture or an illustration or a screenshot, we're simplifying a complex subject, but rather than trying to talk about it with words, we're using another tool to simplify it. And so this is how, when we might use diagrams or illustrations or screenshots. Now I know sometimes in a lot of content, our practice at Oracle is to use as few of those as possible. One, for maintenance reasons, but also because when it comes to translation, it can become very tricky. But there's other ways too. In certain contexts, you might want to use a metaphor to explain something, or an analogy. Anything that can help your audience sort of simplify what they're seeing. And this, again, sort of relates to forced perspective, in that that's a way to sort of make things feel a little bit easier to grasp. So that's readability. So we're going to leave Adventureland and head into Frontierland, and we're going to talk about theming. Now, theming can be thought of as the combination of, it all begins with a story and attention to detail. And it's about using the right details to support your story or theme and ensuring that everything in the attraction fits that. And this can take the form of props and sets and costumes and all that sort of stuff. I want to look at it specifically in the context of two attractions up in Frontierland, Splash Mountain, which is based on the animated portions. Currently, it is based on the animated portion of Song of the South. There are stories and rumors and announcements that it's going to be changed and it's going to be rethemed based on Princess and the Frog. But for now, it's still Splash Mountain. And then next to it is Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. Now, the reason I like this is because theming can take place at different levels. So there might be land level theming, like, so for instance, in Tomorrowland, you'll see lots of fabricated metal and brushed steel, whereas in Adventureland, you'll see wooden thatched roofs and thatched walls and things. And you would never see a shiny, polished, brushed steel hand railing in Adventureland or in Frontierland. Frontierland, we see wood and rustic buildings like these, split rail fences and things like that. But what's interesting too is even though these two attractions share some of that, so you can see the wooden construction and generally, because they're from different sources, they also have details that bring out their unique aspect. So for example, this is the bottom of the bottom of Splash Mountain, and at the bottom there's this big briar patch. And if you look at these and if you look at the pieces of earth that sort of wrap around the flume there, that reddish earth color looks, does it look real? I mean, not so much. And the briars, it looks like it's an attempt to make an animated thing real. So it has a look of an animated film to it. Here's another example. In the Mountain Way, in the attraction structure, there's this doorway and window carved into the building, and they look like they're designed to look like they came from an animated film, as opposed to, this is from some of the structure from Big Thunder Mountain. This looks far more realistic. So while they're both wooden and both rustic and raw wood, the specific treatment of them reinforces their specific theme. You know, Splash Mountain based on, again, the animated portions of Song of the South. Big Thunder Mountain is out west, Monument Valley in Utah. So when the Imagineers tell their stories, they use appropriate details to strengthen their story and to support their creative intent. So they're very mindful of the specific details that they, in our world, again, now we talk about details before, but theming also comes into play. One of the strongest ways in our world and in training too, in instructional design, is in templates and formats and standards. You know, we all have, I'm sure, worked with specific templates and formats. And, you know, one of the distinctions that I just recently kind of came across or put into words anyway, is that one of the reasons why that type of theming is so important is that we have trained our users that differences matter. When we put in a key at the beginning of a document that says boldface means this and italic means this and underline means this, they're looking for difference. And so when we do something that's different in terms of the font or the size or the color or the treatment, we're telling them that it's important. Now, if we do that inadvertently, we're distracting them. I have a very visceral experience with this. I was in a training session and the slide content was very standard, very traditional, or I should say consistent. The heading was one format, one font and style, the body text was another. And then all of a sudden a slide came on that had two other font styles on it. And I stopped paying attention to the content and I wondered why. It completely threw me out of the experience entirely. And so this is a way, you know, the other thing I like to say about this is theming, and this is true in the parks as well as in the in this formatting and templating thing. When it's done well, theming disappears and we don't even notice it. You don't notice the fact that all the railings and all the fences are all rustic wood and, you know, natural looking things in Frontierland. But if there was a brushed steel one, you would notice it. So theming disappears when it's done well, and it stands out when it's done poorly. So now this next slide I'm going to show you is an extreme example of going the wrong way. So not only all of a sudden am I using, I don't have the same template background. I've centered my headings instead of made them right, left justified. I have 4 or 5 different fonts. I have multiple signs. I even have an incorrect word, Disney Imagineers. This is an extreme example. And you may notice like most of my animation has been the fade in standard kind. This one uses like 7 different types of that too. Again, extreme example, but hopefully help drive the point that we need to be mindful of how we do some of this. I'm sorry if I'm going a little long. As you can tell, I get passionate about this. So we're going to stay where we are. We're going to talk about kinetics. And kinetics is about movement and motion and keeping the experience dynamic. And so right near the entrance or the exit from Big Thunder Mountain is this place called Nugget Way. And it's a walkway. It's a little fence it's a fenced in walkway actually, but it's a wooden walkway that comes up. And as you walk up it on the left, on your right, you see these geysers sprout out. And then you see this fenced area that's surrounding some other geysers. At the far end of this little fenced in area is another fence, and you can actually see the Big Thunder Mountain cars go by. And what's interesting is in this particular spot, there is movement or motion everywhere you look. So if you look straight ahead, you see the cars zipping by, the geysers are going off, and behind you, if you turn around, I don't have pictures of it, but behind you, you can see the rivers of America. You might see the Mark Twain riverboat passing by, or the rafts carrying guests to the island, or even guests walking on the island. And so there's always activity. It's a dynamic environment. Another place, if we leave this and we head back down, there's a walkway right near the rivers of America. This is at the bottom of the runoff of Splash Mountain. You can see Splash Mountain up there. That's the plume. Way at the top, hopefully you can see a boat emerging from there. And then you can see this boat here. This is another spot because right behind you again is the rivers of America, and right in front of you is Splash Mountain. And so this is an example of again, what they call kinetics. And this is when the Imagineers tell their stories, they keep the experience dynamic and active. There are very few quiet and still places in Magic Kingdom or any Disney park. They keep it moving through music. A lot of times they'll have flags or banners that blow in the wind, etc. So in our world, how can we do this? Well, one way that is getting more and more popularity is through video content. That's obviously more dynamic than words. In the case of training materials, you might use animation like I did. But even in text, we can keep things dynamic in a way by just mixing up the way we do things. Like to borrow a phrase from the information mapping folks, we want to avoid walls of words, right? So sometimes paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of text are appropriate. It's the right way to do it. But if we can break that up with a diagram or bulleted lists or numbered lists or different types of content, different ways to organize a content or a table, the experience is a little bit more dynamic and a little easier to read for the audience. So now we're going to leave Frontierland, and we're going to head back along the far edge of the park and go back into Liberty Square, and then come up around the far corner of Liberty Square near Fantasyland. And there's a reason there's no title on the slide, because this one's a little different. I don't want to give it away yet, but we're at the Haunted Mansion. And so this is a shot of the Haunted Mansion. And when we go in here, we go into the queue and we go through there's an interactive queue now with lots of little neat things to play with. But we get in our doom buggies and we go into the music room, past the library, past the endless doorway, and we get to the ballroom. That's where the ghosts dance, the famous place where they use Pepper's ghost to have that. And then we go into the attic scene. And as we entering the attic scene, if we look to our left, right away, we see this scene, bunch of junk spattered. If we look a little closer though, we see this. And if you note, this is what's called a hidden Mickey. And hidden Mickeys are, as the name suggests, hidden impressions of Mickey Mouse in various attractions, hotels, restaurants, that the Imagineers put there. The interesting thing for me about hidden Mickeys is that once you see them, you never unsee them, and you never look at them in quite the same way again. And so if you go, next time you go to Magic Kingdom, and I hope some of you have gone and plan to go again when the world is safer, and from what I understand, Disney World is actually pretty safe these days because they're very good about enforcing masks and social distancing and all that. But and you go through the Haunted Mansion, take a look for this, and then once you see it and you see the Mickey, you won't see a pile of junk and plates. You'll see Mickey. You'll see a hidden Mickey. And what this does is, when the Imagineers tell their stories, they use these to involve and engage their audience, and they help them see things in a new way. So now some Imagineers are not fans of hidden Mickeys because they would say, seeing Mickey Mouse in the midst of this Gothic manner takes you out of the experience. And I agree with that to a point, but at the same time, I think it engages the audience in a way that's interesting enough that it's worth it. I like them. I'm not a fanatic about hidden Mickeys. There are some people who that's what they do. There are books published about them. There's scavenger hunts and stuff. And from time to time, I like to point them out with the people I'm with, and I look for them, but it's not my main thing. But again, they help us see things in a slightly different way. So I'm going to look at another example, show you another example. This is about engaging your audience. This comes from a gentleman named Matthew May from one of his books. So what do you see in this? Now, don't type it in the chat yet until everyone's had a chance. Some of you have, I know some of you have seen a presentation like this before, may have seen me do this, but let's keep it a secret. So this is something that we all use every single day. Now, there's a piece of information that's missing, and once I tell you, it'll fill in. This is the uppercase version of the most common letter in the English language, and the letter exists in the white space. So for those who haven't seen it yet, this is the letter E. Now, for me, when I first saw this, once I saw that it was the letter E, I never see this as anything but the letter E. I only see the letter E. I don't see a bunch of lines, unless I deliberately look at it that way. When I see this, I just see the letter E right away. This is another example of the power of hidden Mickeys. Once you see it a certain way, you never see things the same way. How we can use this in our world is to think about ways to help our audience put the pieces together on their own. Now, to caveat, obviously we don't want to leave information out of our content. We don't want to not tell our audience something they need to know. But particularly in a training environment, if you can organize your content in a way so that, you know, when you're on lesson 3, they all of a sudden realize the importance of this thing that you did in lesson 1, and they put it together and they put it all together, they will remember it far more than if you tell them. You know, it's sort of like that expression, tell me and I learn. I can't remember the expression now. I'm sorry, I should have had it with me. But they're basically tell me, involve me. You know, tell me, show me, and involve me, and we get increased levels of engagement. And so the more we can involve and engage our audience in our content, the better they're going to remember it. I apologize for not having that quote handy. I should have written it down and had a separate document. So anyway, that's hidden Mickeys. So now we're right at the corner at the entranceway between Liberty Square and Fantasyland, and we're going to talk about something called transition. As the guests move through the park, the Imagineers try to design transitions between areas to best suit their story. And so what they want is, as the audience travels from scene to scene or attraction to attraction, they want to avoid drastic, abrupt change that tells them, oh my God, you're someplace else. So they use what they call 3-dimensional cross dissolves. Now, I should back up and say, sometimes an abrupt, drastic change is what they want, and they call that a crash cut. But very often they try to use these 3-dimensional cross dissolves to sort of subtly tell the audience that things are changing. In this case, this is the passageway, or the cut through, the passageway between, we are standing in Liberty Square, and you notice the gray path that I talked about the plumbing, that's all the whole width of it now. This is Liberty Square. On the other side of this cut through is Fantasyland. What they do is they use architectural and detail elements and details on each side that represent the other. So this is still on the same side in Liberty Square, but notice this stonework. That doesn't really look very colonial. That looks like the castle, actually. Looks more like stonework that's done with the castle. And then this is from the Fantasyland side. Notice this wrought iron. That looks more like colonial thing. And even the wood design there looks a little in the lamppost. So they use elements from either side to sort of start this cross dissolve. One specific detail they use to do this are the pillars. So if this is coming from Fantasyland, notice these two pillars. This one in the foreground is stone carved, looks sort of like the castle. So in our main field of view, we see this one, and off in the distance we see this other thing. As we walk closer, the stone pillar moves out of our field of vision, and the round colonial style pillar starts to take up a little bit more. And as we get closer, the other one completely fades away, and we see just the colonial one. To see it from the other side, if we're coming from Liberty Square, we see the round pillar, and off in the distance we see that stone thing. As we get closer, the round pillar fades out of our line of sight and is replaced by the stone pillar until we get closer. So they use these architectural elements and three-dimensional cross dissolves to guide our transition between these experiences between Liberty Square, colonial times, and Fantasyland. So when the Imagineers tell their story, they make sure that changes in the experience serve the story they're telling. So what does this mean to us? Well, this is all about how we order and sequence our content. And I have some specific examples from my history and experience, particularly in a training environment. Again, we talked about before, sometimes your subject matter experts will provide content to you, but my experience is, as often as not, they provide stream of conscious kind of content as opposed to structured, organized, thoughtful. How is the audience going to experience this or live through this? So sometimes we need to rearrange it. Sometimes, particularly in a training experience, I think the order that we teach something should be different than the order that it may be done in the real world. So for example, let's say you're configuring something that has 4 steps. But step 3 has 3 sub-steps. So in the real world in practice, you do step 1, you do step 2, you step 3, step 3A, B, C, and then step 4. In training, however, so that we don't bring our audience way down into the weeds too far in these little sub-steps of step 3, what we might do is do step 1, step 2, step 3. By the way, there's more to step 3. We're going to get to that later. And then step 4, and then as a separate part of the exercise or lesson, go into those A, B, and C, so that we're not, again, taking them so far down the rabbit hole of detail and minutia that they lose sight of what they're doing. So sometimes we want to think about the order in which we organize our content to best serve the experience that we want our audience to have. And again, I've used this a couple of times in training. And sometimes it'll happen in traditional tech writing as well. So that's transition. So now we're into Fantasyland, and we're going to talk about something called the It's a Small World effect. And here is It's a Small World. This is a sign of the main marquee near the standby entrance. If you've been to Disney World, and if you've been, or Disneyland, or one of the international parks, and you've been on this ride, I know that the song is already in your head. Disney parks and attractions are designed to be memorable, and one of the ways they do that is through song, and they specifically, create the music to be memorable, and they use repetition to do that. Now, this song, "It's a Small World," is written by the Sherman brothers, Richard and Robert Sherman. They're also the ones that they actually did the music for Mary Poppins. They wrote the song in the Tiki Room, but it's written specifically to be memorable. And in fact, when they were working, I think it was on the World's Fair, and even on this attraction at the World's Fair, somebody was talking to Walt, and they said, "You're spending a lot of time on the music." And his response was, "Well, people don't come out humming the architecture." So he was very deliberate about making sure things were memorable, and music was one of the ways they do that. Now they do this through other ways too. They also use repetition and reinforcement. You know, if you've ever stayed, if you've ever been to Disney World and rode on the monorail, you know that you should stand clear of the doors because they tell you that many times. So with the Imagineers tell their stories, they use repetition and reinforcement to help make the audience's experience memorable. They want people to remember important parts of it. In our world, this is again about reinforcing key ideas. And, you know, I think an important distinction here is that repetition does not equal redundancy. You know, there are times when saying the same thing multiple times can be redundant. Yes, Jen, I do too. I just don't want to give you my impression of it. She said she remembers the Spanish version of the please stand clear of the doors. But we want to use repetition and reinforcement. Now, sometimes repetition can be redundant, but the two are not always equal. If there's something important you need your audience to know, saying it more than once is valid. You know, if for instance, for whatever reason in the design of a particular, again, I'm thinking software, when you create a certain record, once you create it, you can't undo it. You can't, I mean, without deleting it, or you can't, maybe you can't delete it for whatever reason. You know, it's basically you can't go back. You want to tell the audience a couple times that maybe don't forget, be careful before you click save because there's no going back. You know, saying that more than once is okay. If you know, and you know, one thing I tell people when they say we need to add this note to the documentation, I say okay, but remember this document is 1,000 pages, and so once we stick it in there, in many ways, to some audiences, it's lost. So sometimes it's worth maybe saying more than once, rather than just one time in this one specific place. If it's important and worth saying, it might be worth saying more than once. So we just want to think about how we use repetition and reinforcement in our content to make sure that our audience knows what they need to know and remembers what they need to remember. So we're coming on to our last stop in Magic Kingdom. I'm going to talk about post shows at a place called Mickey's PhilharMagic. This is the Fantasyland Theater. It's been home to several different attractions, the Mickey Mouse Revue, the Lion King show, but it's current home to Mickey's PhilharMagic, which is an animated film in which Donald Duck, so it starts, Mickey is going to be doing a concert. He's got an orchestra. He's going to conduct the orchestra and using his Fantasia hat, which you sort of, the sorcerer hat, which you see him wearing there in that picture. The orchestra is just the instruments playing magically. He runs off stage and tells Donald, don't touch my hat. And Donald, of course, touches the hat and finds himself from scene to scene going through a bunch of classic animated Disney films, including Be Our Guest, the Be Our Guest scene from Beauty and the Beast, the Part of Your World scene from The Little Mermaid, I Can't Wait to Be King from The Lion King, The Sorcerer's Apprentice from Fantasia, and finally the Magic Carpet scene of Aladdin. And at the end, he ends up in this swirling whirlwind of instruments, and Mickey shows up, grabs the hat, and all the while Donald is chasing the hat. The hat is constantly evading him. Mickey finally grabs the hat, pulls the orchestra into place. Donald ends up in a tuba and gets blown out. And this is a 3D show, by the way, and so we actually experience some things when the Sorcerer's Apprentice scene when the buckets, the broomsticks are carrying the buckets of water, we get splashed with water. In the Be Our Guest scene, we smell apple pies, etc. When Donald gets blown out of the tuba, it's a 3D effect. We see him go over us, and then we hear a crash behind us. And we look behind us, we see him sticking out of the wall like this. And as we look, he starts to fall, and eventually we hear him say, uh-oh, and he falls in. And that's the end of the show. And the lights come up. And when we leave to our right, and we go up a long ramp. And then at the end of the exit ramp is a gift shop. And if you go into that gift shop, you see this. You see Donald falling from the ceiling through a group of instruments. And so what this does is sort of reinforces this scene that we just saw. It reminds us of the story. Donald fell through the wall. This is where Donald ended up. And so this is an example of a post-show, which, remember, pre-show was tell them what they are going to see. This is the opposite of that. This is the tell them what you told them. So, you know, we tell them what we're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. That's what post shows are all about. Post shows are reinforcing key ideas and themes from your story to help keep your audience engaged. And so this might be summary content. This is, again, one of those things that we definitely look at in training, where you might do a review or you might do a lesson summary, as opposed to, you know, in strict documentation, you may not have a summary, but in certain cases, you want to reinforce key ideas and key concepts to make sure your audience stays engaged and understands them. So one last principle we're going to talk about, I don't have a picture for it, is something called plussing. And this is basically, this is a term Walt Disney used about making things better. He was not one to rest on his laurels. He always wanted things to be better, even when they thought he had done great things. He did this in a number of different ways. You know, he sort of plussed the world of animation through a number of technologies, including synchronized sound, the use of color, and then eventually the use of 3 dimensions using the multi-plane camera. But then, you know, plussing, he always wanted to make things better. And so this is all about improvement through iteration and a constant continual focus on improvement. And so when the Imagineers tell their stories, they consistently ask themselves, how do we make this better? And I think this is something we can certainly do. You know, each time we just want to make things better. We want to, you know, explain our concepts a little more clearly. Hopefully each time we release a set of, say, documentation, we're not just adding the features, but we may think, oh, I wish I had done this, I could do that a little bit better, or whatever. So this is, again, a sort of a constant thing that we want to focus on. So those are the main principles I want to talk about. Now, here we are at our PMC bonus, a look at the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror. So again, I added this just today because I read the description of the session that Maureen wrote, and I really liked it, but I felt bad because I didn't want anybody to think we were going to talk about Hollywood Studios and the Twilight Zone when my whole session was on Magic Kingdom. So this, for those of you not sure, this is the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror. It's at the far end of Hollywood Boulevard in Disney's Hollywood Studios. And it is an example of lots of the principles that we just looked at. So it serves as a weenie because it's, again, you come around the corner and at the end of Hollywood Boulevard, here it sits. It is an example, sorry, my last bullet point may have gone over the part that you can see. It's an example of long, medium, and close shots because at a far view, you just sort of see the tower. As you get closer, you see, oh, there's a whole section of the tower that's no longer there. And then as you get into the queue and into the building, there's all sorts of details, which, you know, speaks to the attention to detail, all sorts of details about the terrible thing that happened in this place. This building is also designed with forced perspective because, again, this is under 200 feet. It focuses on a story. Its content and subject matter is the Twilight Zone. You are about to be in an episode of the Twilight Zone. And they do that. They you know, talk about their creative intent when you're in the pre-show and you go into the library. If you look around the library before the lights go out, there's lots of props from different episodes of the Twilight Zone. One that stands out in my memory is the jukebox from the one with William Shatner, where he and his wife are in the town, and not the jukebox, but the little fortune-telling machine that's in the booth in a little diner. But the creative intent comes across in the film that they do, where Rod Serling basically tells you you're in the Twilight Zone. There's great theming, lots of attention to detail. The pre-show is what I just told you about. The post-show is basically a gift shop, but it's designed like the Hollywood Tower Hotel gift shop. And then there's kinetics. You can't really see it here, but at the top there, the doors open, and you actually see the ride cars going up and down that the guests are on. And sometimes you can even hear them screaming. And it's it's also an example, this last bullet point, I don't know if you can read it, is readability. You can quickly get an idea from this that something has gone wrong here. So I just wanted to give you a quick little look at the Twilight Zone and how it's an example of some of these principles, just to sort of tie in that description that was on your website. So that's a little bonus for this. This is not something I normally do, but I figured what the heck could be fun. So Now, let's look quickly at some examples of tech writing or technical communication and how these principles might come up. So this is the introduction chapter from a document about Oracle Cloud Object Storage. That's right, you are special. This is just the setup guide that we have. So Oracle Cloud Object Storage is a service that Oracle provides. We use it in our software as a way for people, for our customers to deliver files to our software. So this is our object storage setup guide. This is the introductory chapter. It is an example of a number of principles. First off, it serves as a pre-show because it's sort of an introduction. It explains what you're going to see when you go into the rest of this document. It is also, this first block is the story. This tells you what this document's about and its subject matter. Cloud services use object cloud storage as the vehicle to exchange data files with customers during implementation and in production, etc. That tells you what this guide is about. It also provides a long shot of what, the overview, big picture, establishing shot of what this document's going to be. This box down here is about creative intent. This guide provides information about setup and configure of object storage for use with Oracle Utilities Cloud Services. That's what my objective is in this document. And then lastly, the bullet points. These are advanced organizers. They serve as weenies. So somebody looking at this can say, oh, my job is to test this object storage stuff. So look at that initial testing of object storage connectivity. That's where I want to go. So it tells them what to see, and tells them that they're in the right place, hopefully, at least. So that's one example. Another is one of our products is something called Oracle Utilities Customer to Meter. And it is a customer information system that uses a number of different data objects to define a customer, including a customer that can have one or more related accounts, each of which can have one or more service agreements. A premise or service location, which can have one or more service points, each of which can have one or more related meters. And records that connect each service point to a corresponding service agreement. Okay, so that's a description, a high-level description of some of these objects that are used, but we can also describe them this way with a picture. So this diagram sort of distills and simplifies the complexity of what this, and this diagram is called the V, and you see it's got the premise, physical location side, geographic on one side, demographic on the other, customer, account, service agreement, service location, meter location, device, and then a relationship. So that sort of I think it's a good example. I might be biased. I did not create this diagram, full disclosure, but I think it's a good example of a relatively complicated sort of thing, like this can have more than one of these and all this relationships, but it simplifies it into this one thing and makes it a readable sort of thing. So those are just some simple examples. At this point, I know where I'm going kind of long. I don't know how much time we had budgeted for this, but hopefully that's okay. Open any questions if we want, or I can go into the next subject, which is, why don't we do that and we can talk questions at the end. The Imagineering Storytelling Checklist. I'm not going to read all of these, but for each of these principles, this checklist is questions that you can use to sort of see, are you using these? Are you using, what type of weenie makes sense for your story, and should you use one? Could you use graphic design to capture audience's attention and interest? What is your story? What's your subject matter? Are you basing your decisions about your message on your subject matter? Long, medium, and close shots. What is your establishing shot, your medium shot, your close-up? Are you moving your audience from the general to the specific? Are you trying to adjust your audience perspective to help communicate your message? Are you using forced perspective? Can you shrink the size of your message somehow? What is your objective and what is your creative intent? And are you evaluating the elements of your content to make sure they help you support your objective? Are you paying attention to detail? Are you providing too little? Are you providing too much? Are you introducing your content? Are you simplifying your complex ideas? Are you using the details that support your story? Are you being consistent in your formatting and fonts and colors and styles? Are you being dynamic as much as you can within the context of your content? Are you engaging? How are you engaging and involving your audience? Are you looking for ways for your audience to figure things out on their own? Are you asking them questions to force them to think about your message and how it applies to them? Are there specific things that you can use to help create effective transitions? Are you avoiding abrupt change? Are you considering different ways to organize your content? Are you using repetition to help reinforce ideas? Are you using repetition to help reinforce ideas? Yes, the repetition is intentional. And then, are you reinforcing your subject matter for your audience? How are you? And do you reinforce it at the end of your story? And then lastly, how can you make your audience experience better? One thing I didn't mention about plussing, Imagineers engage in plussing. They have a team called Show Quality Standards, or SQS, that actually they go into the parks and they experience things and they note things that need to be better. So sometimes plussing in the parks is a simple refurbishment where they freshen up the paint and they clean things up, and they, sometimes it's complete massive change to an attraction. So, are you plussing as well? So, just to sort of close out, and then I'll stay on and we can chat as much as you all want. I believe that technical communication, information, and development are creative fields, and as such, we should look for places where we can, other examples of creativity and creative work to help us do those jobs. I think useful ideas and insights, and I hope you find some of this insightful and useful, can come from unlikely sources. And turns out that a visit to the Disney theme parks could be fun and research. So with that, thank you very much for your time, for letting me go a little bit long and ramble on about this. As you can tell, I do love to talk about it. So I'm happy to stay on and chat about this as much as you guys would all like to.
All right. Thanks, Lou. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or type it in the chat. We'll stay on for a few minutes here. And if you can stop sharing your screen, I'll switch over to mine.
Yeah, I got to figure out how to do that.
Oh.
Oh, there you go. Sorry. Yep.
Yeah.
Here we go.
That was really great, Lou. I've waited since Interchange when you and I first met to watch this, so it was worth the wait.
Oh, cool. Thanks. Yeah, I remember meeting there, but I also, there's obviously other stuff going on. I remember did the keynote there, so I'm glad it was worth the wait.
Yeah, and I think just to iterate what you said before, you have a course that kind of goes into greater detail about this with the STC. So if there's any new members or even current members who want to do this, check out the STC education site. This is for the whole society, and Lou's going to be putting that together very soon, and you can go into greater detail.
Actually started yesterday.
I'm pitching for you here, man.
Yeah, it started yesterday, but that was just the first session, and it was recorded. So
yeah,
cool.
And the first session was just an introductory. In fact, next week we're going to dig into what's called the foundations of Imagineering. So all these principles fit in that pyramid that was in that book. And the first 5, which is story, creative intent, attention to detail, theming, and long, medium, and close shots. Those are the foundations of Imagineering. That's what next week's lesson's about. We're going to dig into a lot more detail about those and more specific examples in technical communication for each.
Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
What inspired you to get involved with or use Imagineering to make your analogies with what we do in technical communication? Was it just that you're a big, huge Disney fan, or was there more to it than that? Just that?
Well, a little bit more. I mentioned it briefly. So my first trip to Disney World was on my honeymoon, and I was working as a game designer then. I was working in a quote creative field, but this was like creativity I'd never seen before. This was like something so cool and so new and so wow. And I became fascinated. And so I started, at the time, there weren't a lot of books about it. Right now, I have a library of more than 200 books about Disney parks and Imagineering. Wow. And I'm a little obsessed. But I started to study because I thought, well, and I'm a big believer that there's lessons everywhere, right? And that the things that, insights from one field that are applicable in another. And so I was working as a game designer. What can I learn from how they design these parks in designing games? So I started looking, and then, you know, for a while I didn't go for about 10 years because, you know, we went on our honeymoon, we went in 95, and then, you know, kids and life and stuff. But then as I started collecting, I sort of went back to this, you know, what is the process? You know, what are the main steps to the process? And I was making some progress and reading, and then I'm reading this book about Pirates of the Caribbean, and it talks about readability, and you know, the key is to create these readable scenes. And like I said, this is I had a sort of an insight, like this is what we do in instructional design. When we create a diagram or a slide that explains something, a flow diagram or whatever, we're simplifying a complex subject. So then I said, well, what else do they do that makes sense? Oh, story is subject matter. Ooh, introductions and exits are pre-shows and post-shows. So I started looking for what they do, and I saw parallels. And the first version of this was an instructional design version, and I delivered it at a conference for an organization that is no longer around. It was called SALT, the Society for Applied Learning Technology. And I delivered it at a conference in Orlando, actually, which was kind of cool because at night I went to Disney World. So I started with that, and then I eventually said, well, it could also work for technical communication. And then meantime, I wrote the first book, The Imagineering Pyramid, which is a more generic sort of approach. And what I did in that was I talk about each principle in general terms, and then I had a chapter on how these work in game design, because it's a field I know, instructional design, and then even management and leadership. And then I think Interchange was the first place where I actually presented this content. And the Interchange presentation was a little different than this. I didn't have pictures. I didn't have as many pictures, and it wasn't structured like a tour the way this one is. But that was the first time I really presented this from a strictly technical communication perspective. And the response has been really positive. Right, actually, yes. Good. And I have another presentation about the process. So what I don't really get into this is the Imagineering process is sort of the steps that they go through. Again, I mentioned before, you know, like we need a new ride in Fantasyland. How do you get from that to having Snow White's the Seven Dwarfs Mine Train? So I have another process oriented presentation, and actually I think I'm going to be doing that as a workshop for the Rochester branch in the fall, which is going to take folks through. It'll also talk about all these principles, but take them through the 7 main steps of this process, where I'll ask the participants to identify a project they're working on and to go through the steps. You know, and the first step is identifying your need. You know, what are your need, your requirements and constraints? Like, why are you doing this? And that's important because a lot of times in business, we end up addressing symptoms instead of real needs, right? So you need to be very clear about what you need to do, and then you brainstorm and do what's called blue sky, where you create a vision for your project. Then concept development, where you flesh it out and you say, okay, well, the vision's nice, but I don't know enough to build it yet. So then you flesh it out to know what you need to build. Then you move to design, where you're like, how am I going to build this? And then you go to construction, to actually building it. Along the way, you might use prototypes and proofs of concepts and models. And then finally, you open it and release it, or in the case of our, you know, publish it, or if it's a course, you deliver it, or whatever it might be. Fortunately, many of the local chapters that I've had the opportunity to chat with have been interested in giving an opportunity to speak about this. So I'm speaking for the Chicago branch in April, and I think I'm doing a similar presentation to this during the Spectrum virtual conference in April as well.
Cool.
So like I said, the response has been pretty good. I'm very, very happy about that.
Great.
Looks like everyone's starting to kind of file out, so I guess we'll wrap things up here. Thanks again to Lou, and thanks to everybody for coming. On the screen now, if you want to write it down, are the ways that you can join STC and also volunteer for treasurer. Just send an email to president@stc-pmc.org. And you can sign up at stc.org and just make sure you pick the Philadelphia Metro chapter. All right, so thanks again, everybody.